I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling the cold emptiness on her side of the bed. Something was wrong. The darkness pressed in around me, and the silence in the room, usually comforting, felt suffocating this time. I reached for my phone. It was 3:12 a.m. The bed next to me was untouched. Where is she? I sent a message. Everything okay? Time crawled unbearably slowly, and still, there was no response. I called her, but the line went straight to voicemail. My thoughts raced, blending worry with anger. At that moment, I didn't know this was the beginning of something that would change my life forever. That evening had started like so many others. My wife, Susan, my younger brother, Ethan, and his girlfriend, Carol, had all piled into the SUV for one of our usual night drives out into the woods. It was a small tradition of ours, a way to escape the monotony of life in a small town. With not much else to do around here, we often sought adventure in the quiet, starlit nights. The energy in the car was light and carefree. Ethan, as always, was the life of the party. He cracked jokes, making Carol laugh so hard she could barely breathe. I sat in the passenger seat, while Susan was in the back seat beside Carol. From time to time, her hand reached forward to rest on my shoulder, a small, familiar gesture that always gave me a sense of peace. We stopped at a clearing under the stars, unloading the cooler we'd brought along and settling in for some beers and conversation. Laughter echoed through the crisp night air, blending with the occasional rustle of the forest. Ethan always took center stage during these outings, telling stories that kept everyone hooked. I noticed Susan was unusually attentive to him that night, laughing a little louder at his jokes, her gaze lingering a little longer than usual. She seemed different. Her energy was brighter, her laugh warmer, her movements more animated than I'd seen in a while. It didn't bother me at the time. In fact, I liked seeing her happy. But something about the way she looked at Ethan, it caught my attention, though I shrugged it off as friendly familiarity. As the night wore on, I decided to head home early. I had an early morning ahead of me, and the idea of staying up late didn't appeal to me as much as it used to. "I'll come home later," Susan said as I grabbed my keys. Her voice was soft, and her kiss on my cheek was warm. "Don't wait up too long." I nodded, trusting her words. Susan had always been responsible, and I had no reason to think otherwise. I got into my car and drove home. The quiet hum of the engine filled the silence, and I turned on the radio to keep myself awake. My thoughts didn't linger on Susan, Ethan, or Carol. I figured they'd have a few more drinks, enjoy the night, and come home a little later. But now, sitting in the dark, staring at the cold phone in my hand, that uneasy feeling crept in again. Something wasn't right. And then, I heard the sound I had been waiting for, the faint creak of the door opening as Susan walked into the house. I got up from the bed and stepped into the hallway to meet her. She looked strange, too put together, too radiant for someone who had just come back from drinking in the woods. Her hair was neatly brushed, and her face glowed like she had just walked out of a celebration, not the wilderness. "Hey, love," she said casually, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "You're back late," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "Oh yeah." Carol wanted to stay out a little longer, and Ethan, well, you know how he is. "I couldn't leave early," she said with a soft smile. Her words were smooth, too smooth. "Why didn't you text me back?" I asked, sharper than I intended. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment before she gave me an apologetic smile. "Oh, my phone died. Sorry, babe. You were asleep anyway, weren't you?" She set a plate of toast and eggs on the counter for me and kissed me on the cheek before sitting across from me. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the unease gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake it. The way she seemed so radiant, it didn't sit right. For the next couple of weeks, life returned to normal. Or at least, it pretended to. Susan acted like nothing had happened that night, and I tried to push my unease to the back of my mind. She was attentive, affectionate even, going out of her way to make me feel loved. For a while, I let myself believe that I was just overthinking things, that maybe she was just having fun that night and lost track of time. But then, something happened that broke the illusion. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Susan turned to me, her expression hesitant. "Stan," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. Her tone wasn't dramatic, but there was something in it that made my heart pound. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated for a moment before blurting it out. "I'm pregnant." The words hit me like a truck. "Pregnant?" I blinked, trying to process what she'd just said. That's great," I stammered, though the words felt foreign in my mouth. Susan and I had talked about kids before, but with her medical condition, one that made conception nearly impossible, we'd always known it was a long shot. "But I thought—" "It's a miracle," she interrupted, her eyes watering. "I didn't think it could happen either, but it has." She grabbed my hands, her grip firm, almost desperate. "Stan, I know this is a shock, but isn't this what we always wanted?" Her words should have been reassuring, but instead, they planted a seed of doubt. Something about her urgency, her eagerness to frame this as a miracle, didn't sit right with me. Over the next few days, the doubt grew. We hadn't been reckless. In fact, we'd been cautious to the point of paranoia because of her condition. So how could this happen? We had long, emotional conversations about what to do. Despite the initial shock, I was ready to step up, but Susan was the one who hesitated. Ultimately, she decided to terminate the pregnancy, explaining that the risks were too high and the timing wasn't right. I supported her through it, taking time off work, staying by her side, and comforting her through her tears. We grieved together, and for a moment, I thought we were stronger for it. But the nagging doubt remained, buried under the surface like a splinter I couldn't reach. Years passed. By then, the pregnancy and everything surrounding it had become a distant memory. Life had settled into its usual rhythm. Or so I thought. One night, Ethan and I were sitting on the porch of his house, sharing a couple of beers. The stars were out, and the air was heavy with that small-town stillness that makes everything feel more intimate than it should. We started reminiscing about old times, about those late-night off-road trips and the chaos they often brought. It was light-hearted at first, but then I brought up that night. "You remember that night in the woods?" I said, keeping my tone casual. "The one where I left early, and you guys stayed behind?" Ethan froze for a moment, the bottle halfway to his lips. It was subtle, but I caught it, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes darted away from mine for just a second too long. "What about it?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent. "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "I always wondered what you guys got up to after I left." He laughed nervously. "Not much. Just hung out, drank some more." He took a long sip of his beer, his hand trembling slightly. That's when I knew. There was something he wasn't telling me. And I wasn't leaving until I found out. I pressed him, keeping my tone light but insistent. At first, he deflected, making jokes to steer the conversation elsewhere. But eventually, the cracks started to show. Finally, after what felt like hours, he broke. "Look, Stan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I screwed up, okay? God, I didn't mean for it to happen." My chest tightened. "What the hell are you talking about?" "It was that night," he said, his voice cracking. "After we dropped off Carol. Susan and it just happened." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "You're kidding me," I said, my voice low and deadly. Ethan buried his face in his hands. "It was a mistake. A stupid, drunken mistake. I don't even know how it happened. But Stan, I swear, I've regretted it every day since. I couldn't breathe. My own brother. My wife." My mind raced, connecting the dots. That night. Her strange behavior. The pregnancy. That baby, I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It wasn't mine, was it?" Ethan looked up, his face pale. He didn't say anything, But his silence was answer enough. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down. I don't remember driving home that night. The rage, the heartbreak, the betrayal, they all blended together into a white-hot blur. By the time I reached the house, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the door. Susan was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I came in, her face lighting up with a smile, so normal, so casual, as if the foundation of my world hadn't just been ripped out from under me. "Hey, you're back early," she said, her voice cheerful, like nothing was wrong. I stood there in the doorway, staring at her. Every word Ethan had said echoed in my mind. The way he'd avoided my eyes, the way his voice broke when he finally admitted what they'd done. It was all true. "Stan," she said, her smile fading. "What's wrong?" I stepped into the room, shutting the door behind me with more force than I intended. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold and sharp. Her expression shifted instantly, her body tensing as she sat up straighter. "What's going on?" I didn't bother sitting down. I pulled the chair from the dining table, turned it to face her, and sat with my elbows on my knees, staring at her. "Ethan told me everything." She froze, her eyes widening. What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Susan," I snapped. "He told me what happened that night. After you dropped off Carol. After I went home. He told me about the two of you." The color drained from her face. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Say something," I growled. Her hands trembled as she placed her phone down on the coffee table. "Stan." She stammered, her voice cracking. "You what?" I barked, standing up so quickly the chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You what, Susan? You cheated on me? With my brother? Do you even understand what the hell you've done?" Tears sprang to her eyes, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Stan, please, it wasn't like that. It was a mistake. It was stupid, and I regret it more than you can imagine. Don't you dare try to minimize this," I snapped, my voice trembling with fury. "You betrayed me. Both of you did. And that baby, you let me think it was mine. We mourned it together, Susan. I took care of you through the entire process, and the whole time, you knew it wasn't mine." Her face crumpled, and she broke down sobbing, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't know for sure," she cried. "I swear, I didn't know. I thought maybe it could have been yours." "Could have been?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Are you hearing yourself right now? You had no idea if it was mine or his, and you didn't think I deserved to know? You lied to me, Susan. You let me believe it was a miracle, that we could finally have a child. You ripped my heart out, and for what? For him." "It wasn't like that," she sobbed. "It was a stupid, drunken mistake. It didn't mean anything. It was one time, Stan. Just one time. Please, you have to believe me." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer, but they only made the anger burn hotter. One time. That's supposed to make this better? One time is all it takes, Susan. One time, and you've destroyed everything we had. She stood up, her face streaked with tears, and reached for me again. "I love you, Stan. I love you. Please, we can get past this. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I can't lose you. I won't lose you." I stepped back again, shaking my head. "You already lost me, Susan. The second you decided to climb into bed with my brother, you lost me." Her sobs grew louder, and she collapsed back onto the couch, clutching the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I hate him too," she cried. "He shouldn't have let it happen. He was supposed to be your brother, and he betrayed you just as much as I did. Please, Stan, don't let him destroy us. Don't let him win." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. Don't let him win. Susan, this isn't some game. This is my life. Our life. And you both destroyed it. There's no coming back from this. Not for us. Not for me. Her sobs turned into wails as I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my head spinning. I couldn't stay in that house, not with her crying on the couch like she was the victim. I grabbed my keys and got into my car, driving aimlessly through the empty streets of our town. The same streets I'd driven 1,000 times before, but that night, they felt foreign. Everything felt foreign. I don't know how long I drove that night. The streets blurred past, their familiarity only making the ache in my chest worse. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalks, and every turn felt meaningless. I wasn't headed anywhere. I finally stopped at the edge of town, where the road gave way to a stretch of woods. I killed the engine, and for a long time, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Her words echoed in my head on a cruel, endless loop. Asterisk, it was just one time. Asterisk. I didn't know for sure. I love you, Stan. I wanted to scream. I wanted to hit something. But instead, I sat there in the silence, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just the affair, though God knows that was bad enough. It was the lies, the deliberate choices to keep me in the dark, to let me believe in a life that had never been real. I had trusted Susan. I had trusted Ethan. They were two of the most important people in my life, and they'd both torn that trust to shreds without a second thought. And the baby! I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, the sharp pain shooting through my hand a welcome distraction from the chaos in my head. We had mourned that child together. I had held her as she cried, whispering promises that we would get through it, that we would be okay. All that time she knew. She knew, and she still let me believe it was mine. Had she ever planned to tell me the truth? Or would she have taken that secret to her grave if Ethan hadn't cracked? I leaned my head back against the seat, staring up at the stars through the windshield. I couldn't stop the memories from flooding in. The way she had smiled at me on our wedding day, the way she would curl up next to me on the couch during lazy Sunday afternoons, the way she would hum to herself while cooking dinner. Those memories were poison now. Every happy moment was tainted, every laugh hollow. I couldn't trust any of it. Was she thinking about him while she held my hand? Was she hiding her guilt behind those smiles? I thought about Ethan, too. My younger brother, the kid I had always looked out for, the one I'd defended every time he got into trouble growing up. I'd been proud of him, even when he made mistakes, because I thought he was a good person at heart. Now, all I could feel was disgust. He had looked me in the eyes so many times after that night. He had laughed with me, shared drinks with me, acted like everything was fine. He'd even let me grieve a child that wasn't mine without saying a damn word. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could he do this to me? How could they do this to me? By the time I got home, it was nearly dawn. The house was silent. I half expected to find Susan still sitting on the couch, but the living room was empty. I found her in the bedroom, curled up on her side of the bed. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. For a moment, I just stood there in the doorway, staring at her. She looked so small, so vulnerable. And for a second, just a second, I felt the urge to comfort her. But then the anger surged back, and I remembered why I couldn't. I grabbed a pillow and a blanket from the hall closet and headed to the guest room. As I shut the door behind me, the weight of everything crashed down on me all over again. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't silence. I thought about leaving, about packing a bag and driving as far away as I could. But where would I go? And what would I do? I thought about confronting Ethan again, demanding answers he probably didn't have. But what good would that do? Nothing he said could undo what had been done. And then I thought about Susan, about the life we had built together. Was it all a lie? Or had it just Unraveled? I wanted to believe she had loved me. I wanted to believe that, at some point, what we had was real. But how could I believe that now, knowing what I knew? The worst part was the doubt. I doubted her, I doubted Ethan, and I doubted myself. How had I not seen it? How had I missed the signs? Was I blind, or was I just too trusting? I hated them both, but a small part of me hated myself more. When the sun finally rose, I sat up in bed, my chest heavy with exhaustion. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay trapped in this limbo. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and started typing a message to someone who might give me some clarity. A mutual friend who had been there for us through thick and thin. "Can we talk?" The response came quickly. "Of course. Come over whenever you need." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, pulled on a jacket, and left the house without a word to Susan. She was awake when I passed the bedroom door, her red, swollen eyes locked with mine for a fleeting moment, but I didn't stop. I didn't care about the tears streaking down her face. Whatever guilt she was feeling couldn't erase what she had done. The drive to my friend Daniel's house was a blur. Daniel had been one of my closest friends for years, someone who had been there through every high and low in my life. If anyone could help me see things clearly, it was him. When I got to his house, Daniel didn't ask questions. He just opened the door, handed me a cup of coffee, and let me sit in silence until I was ready to talk. Finally, I told him everything. I laid it all out: the betrayal, the lies, the pregnancy, Ethan's confession. The words spilled out in a rush, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and despair. By the time I finished, Daniel was sitting across from me, his face a mask of shock and disgust. "That's Jesus, Stan," he said, shaking his head. "I don't even know what to say." "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I feel like I've lost everything. My wife, my brother, my entire damn life. It's all gone." Daniel leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Listen to me, man. You haven't lost anything. They're the ones who threw everything away. They're the ones who lied, who betrayed you. That's on them, not you." I wanted to believe him, but it didn't feel that simple. "It still feels like I'm the one who's been destroyed," I muttered. "Like they took everything from me, and I'm just nothing now." "You're not nothing," Daniel said firmly. "You're stronger than this. I know you are." He paused for a moment before leaning back in his chair, his expression turning thoughtful. "What are you thinking about doing? Staying? Leaving? Confronting them both?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I just know I can't let them get away with this. Not without consequences." That night, I went home with a plan. I walked through the front door to find Susan waiting for me in the living room, her eyes bloodshot, her hands gripping the edge of the couch like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Out," I said flatly, not bothering to elaborate. "We need to talk, Stan," she said, standing up. Her voice was shaky, but there was a desperation in it that grated on my nerves. "No, we don't," I said, my tone cold. "I've said everything I needed to say. Now, it's time for action." Her face crumpled. "Action? What do you mean?" "You'll find out soon enough," I said, brushing past her and heading to the bedroom. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. I wanted out of this marriage, but I wanted to do it on my terms. I wanted to protect myself, to make sure Susan didn't get a single thing more than she deserved. I explained everything to the lawyer: the betrayal, the lies, the emotional damage. He listened carefully, taking notes, and assured me we'd build a solid case. "If you have any evidence, gather it," he said. "Texts, emails, anything that proves what happened." I only had photos from that night in the woods, which now seemed like a cruel joke. But I didn't stop there. I wasn't content with just walking away quietly. They had ruined my life, and I wanted the world to see them for who they really were. I started with Ethan. One night, I showed up at his house unannounced. He opened the door, his face pale as soon as he saw me. "Stan, listen, No, I interrupted, stepping inside and slamming the door behind me. "You're going to listen." "I'm not just walking away from this, Ethan," I said, my voice low and firm. "You've destroyed my life, and now, I'm going to destroy yours." "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You'll see," I said, turning on my heel and walking out the door. It didn't take long for the word to spread. Friends, family, co-workers. I made sure everyone knew the truth. I didn't have to embellish or exaggerate. The facts spoke for themselves. Ethan's reputation was shredded within days, and Susan wasn't far behind. At first, she begged me to stop, sobbing and pleading for forgiveness. But when she realized I wasn't backing down, her desperation turned to anger. "You're ruining my life," she screamed one night as I packed my things. "No, Susan," I said calmly, looking her in the eye. "You ruined your life. I'm just making sure everyone knows it." When the divorce was finalized, I walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter than I had in years. It wasn't over. I knew the pain would take time to heal, but I finally felt like I had control again. Susan and Ethan were no longer my problem. I moved to a new town, started fresh, and slowly began rebuilding my life. The betrayal left scars, but it also taught me something important. I deserved better. I still think about that night sometimes. The night it all began. I wonder if there was a way to stop it before it happened, if I could have done something differently. But then I remind myself, it wasn't my failure. It was theirs. And I'm better off without them. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have forgiven them? Or would you have burned it all to the ground like I did?